if you understand that, then you can sort of conceptualize on a much more complex level, using that analogy as sort of the foundation. The biggest threat to power itself is the mechanisms of resistance inherent to the network of power. There's no outside power, right? The resistance to power is the function of power. The functioning of power itself creates resistance, and that resistance, the product of its own power, or some really deep crap. I was about to cuss, right? On some next level crap. The product of the function of power is itself its greatest resistance. The function of power is itself its greatest resistance, right? You know, you get too powerful, you present a challenge and a threat to yourself, not anyone else. And I think just a quick aside, because it just hit me like a brick. I still love track. I run all the time. But I really was like addicted to track and field in high school. And you know, it was Carl Lewis and then Ben Johnson and Michael Johnson. And when I saw Michael Johnson break the world record in the 200 meters, where he pulls up his hamstring, like his hamstring almost burst. It was the greatest, and it still is to this day for me, the greatest display of human, I don't want to say supremacy, but the human ability that I've ever witnessed in my life. Michael Johnson wasn't running against anybody. He's running against himself. He's running against this phantasm he's created in his mind. And it's that thing that's always a step ahead of him. And he's way ahead of the competition. He blows through, breaks the world record, and he almost exploded his hamstring because the sheer force of his unstoppable nature works against himself. Right? He will himself destroy himself. Right? You need to put a break on him. I got to keep that in mind myself. I mean, I went off on a bit of a tangent, but yeah, that's super deep, right? That's super deep. Hence, there's no single locus of great refusal, no soul of revolt, source of all rebellions, or pure law of the revolutionary. Instead, there is a plurality of resistances, as I said, with the gears, with the muscle fibers, with the intellect. It's the network itself is structured, and each point, each force relation is a source of resistance. Each of them a special case. So I drew this sort of as a visual. It's not the greatest example, but I mean, I have to sort of visualize it. I think my examples that I told you before were pretty good. So here's red. So think about this as a source of resistance, right? And think about it like this, right? You have, as we know, power looks something like this. Right? Power looks like this. And imagine that black is a state of non-resistance, red is a state of resistance. What this should be looking like is, first of all of these should be moving. This should be dynamic. All of this should be moving around dynamically. And this should be flashing black, red. This should be flashing black, red. Everything should be flashing black and red. Black, a state of non-resistance. Red, a state of resistance. And you can imagine that we have these balls, right? And just imagine that, I can't animate this, but imagine that when it's red, if it bumps into something that's black, it transfers the resistance. And now this is, and so on. Every time it touches a color of opposite color, it transforms the color of this other thing. This is the nature of the network, right? It's internal resistance. It's internal resistance. And we recognize that this representation shows that it's not sort of this procession, as I said before. Right? It's not this procession. Right? It's in a perpetual state of flux. Everything's bouncing around. It's like that video game, I think it's called, what's it called? Dots or something like that. I just got onto this. I'm a little late. Is it called Dots? It's like these little dots, black and red dots that are all the way around. You have to try and grab the dots and, you know, get a dot count or something. I forget what it is. It's a great game to just veg out on. But that's this. Everything's in a state of flux. There's no regularity. All of the movements are random. And each of these are flashing. And there's a transference of black and red. Sometimes, if you were to pause it, theoretically, there would be more instances of resistance within the network. There might be less instances of resistance in the network. Right? This is conceptually the idea. And the reason why you need that conception, that visual, I think, in your head, I mean, it helps me, is it helps me see the relationship to my example of Michael Johnson. It helps me see the relationship in the example of the car and the mechanisms within the car. Now let's try and take this very, very abstract idea now and apply it in its final stage to the occupation movement. So, movement, specific note, the very existence of the occupation movement creates a force relation of power within the social order. Right? The very fact that the nature of the Occupy movement is at stake. People ask about, and you know, it took me a long time to get to this. I've been thinking about occupation for, and I mean like critically thinking on an intellectual level about occupation movement for about 2 weeks now. And you know, participated, and I was just in absorption mode for a long time, taking notes and trying to make sense of the phenomena. And now I'm starting to really recognize the one thing that is at the heart of the Occupy movement, the thing that is at the heart of the Occupy movement, and it is occupation. Whoopsie. It is occupation, right? It is this, right? It is this. It is the occupation of the social strata. It is the occupation of the social network. It is the occupation of the social nexus. It is occupation. It is taking a position both virtually and literally, right? It is taking a position. And I had a good question a few days ago in a previous video. I said, you know, there is the status quo and it has a paradigm. Occupation movement is vying for that opening, quote unquote, in the social nexus. And someone asked a very insightful question. Dr. Campbell, it doesn't make sense to say that the occupation is going to sort of infiltrate or take over the financial sector, because the occupation movement has nothing itself to do with the financial sector. And this is the point that I want to make. It's not the occupation itself. It's individual representatives in the occupation movement. They move with the ideology, which I'll talk about next, right? And then I think the next section is about ideology. If it's not the next, no, 2 sections from now, I'll talk about ideology. But it's the ideology of occupation, right? So that if you, in my example of Christianity, which I think was my response to whoever the person was, Nietzsche famously has a loathing hatred for Christianity. This is not to segue into a discussion of Christianity, just to give you an idea. Christianity challenges scientific institution because Christians enter into scientific institution with their Christian ideology. And they supplant, in a negative sense, or integrate in a sort of mutual sense, their Christian ideological conceptions into the institution of science. And science now is informed by Christian dogma. This is Nietzsche's famous sort of scathing critique, right? Science and Christianity as a religious institution couldn't be more different. It's not the actual institution vying for the opening. It's the institution and those individuals who are occupied within the institution of the Occupy movement, leaving the movement with the ideology, leaving the movement with the training, leaving the movement with a greater social understanding of inequality, of power imbalances, of desubjectification, and recognizing that there's a larger structure. They then are themselves economists, mathematicians, physicists, scientists, philosophers, students, educators. They go back to their respective spheres of the social, which we'll see in a later discussion, and they transform those spheres slowly. They integrate slowly the movement ideology, which is still yet to be articulated. I'm going to help in articulating what that thing is, with this sense of occupation, with this sense of presence. I am here. I am here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, through rain, hail, sleet, sunshine. If you can speak English, you have access to, and I wish I could speak other languages, right? I wish, I could, get this in more languages, but this lecture is a global lecture. I am not doing this lecture for people in the United States of America. This is a global lecture, right? This occupation movement, at least virtually, is a 365, 24/7 occupation. the idea of occupation is that it is this perpetual occupation